first Saturday of October, the Hargrove Vineyard harvest dinner was already 3 hours in when the last tractor came down from the upper slope. Reed Calloway had been repairing the crush pad conveyor since 4 in the afternoon. His hands were still stained with hydraulic fluid when the caterers began lighting the lanterns along the barrel house walk. Someone at the long tables said something about the new owner being exactly what the valley needed. Then she was walking past the crush pad toward the barrel house door. She stopped. Reed said it before he had decided to. "Whoever ends up running this place with you is going to be a lucky man." Sloane Hargrove answered without turning around. "I was hoping that might be you. If that opening caught you, drop the word stay in the comments before we go any further." 5:30 the next morning. The fog was still in the lower vines and the dew on the equipment hadn't burned off yet. Reed walked the long way around the dinner wreckage. The white linen still on the tables, the lanterns cold, and went straight to the equipment barn. Bud Ferris looked up from the parts bin. He was the only man on the property who held Reed's eyes a half-second longer than the situation called for. He said nothing. He filled a second mug from the thermos and pushed it to the edge of the workbench. By 7, Reed was home. The kitchen of his small ranch house on the south end of the property smelled of burnt toast and the particular sweetness that came off the vines in harvest season. Even inside, even with the windows closed, his daughter Wren sat at the table in her school clothes, drawing something on the back of a feed receipt. The drawing had 4 legs, but the proportions were wrong for any animal Reed could identify. "You came in late," she said. "Conveyor belt." "Just a conveyor belt?" "Just a conveyor belt." She accepted that. She added a tail to whatever the animal was supposed to be and did not look up again. On the top floor of the Hargrove estate house, Sloane stood at the east window with a coffee that had gone cold before she remembered she was holding it. The vineyard below was the color of copper in the early light. Cass Devlin, her operations manager, knocked once and let himself in. He had a folder under his arm and the careful face of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say. "Drummond filed the motion this morning," he said. "He's calling for an emergency trustee review. 30 days. She nodded. "Sloane." She did not turn from the window. He waited. After a moment, he set the folder on the writing desk and left. She did not look at the folder. She looked at the photograph on the mantel. Her father at the bottling line 8 years ago. Her own younger self beside him, laughing at something that had not survived the photograph. At noon, she came down to the equipment barn. No call ahead. The barn door was rolled open and Reed was on his back under the secondary pump housing with a flashlight between his teeth. She stopped 3 feet from the edge of the tarp he'd laid down. He felt a shadow before he registered who made it. He came out from under the housing and stood without making it a production. "Irrigation audit for the south block," she said. "I'd like it by Thursday. You'll have it Wednesday." She nodded. She did not move toward the door. "Anything else, Miss Hargrove?" She looked at him. He looked at her. The barn around them. The smell of machine oil and crushed grape must. The low argument of a fan belt somewhere deeper in the building did not pause. "No," she said. "That's all." She turned to go. He let her get 4 steps. "I shouldn't have said what I said last night." She stopped walking. She did not turn around. "You think I would have answered if you hadn't?" She kept walking. He stood with the flashlight still in his hand for a long moment after the door swung shut. Then he sat down on the wheel housing and looked at the floor the way a man does when something has happened that he cannot yet categorize as good or bad. That evening, he stood at the fence line of the upper slope and watched the last of the light go off the eastern ridge. Bud came up beside him and handed him an open bottle of cider without asking. "You meant to say it," Bud said. "Not last night. There's no right night for something like that." They stood without talking until the lights came on in the estate house across the property. The next morning, Sloane stayed at the writing desk past her usual hour. She had 8 emails she had not read. She stood and walked to the mantel and took the photograph down and laid it flat on the desk, the Hargrove Reserve label that her father had called the finest thing he'd ever signed off on. He'd said it at the release dinner in 2016. She had been 24 and standing beside him, and she had asked who designed the label art. He had said the young man is too careful about his work to have attention put on it too soon. She had laughed. Her father had not. Cass came in with the morning schedule. He glanced at the photograph on the desk. He glanced at her. Callaway, he said, as if it had just occurred to him. Before he came here, he had a design consultancy, specialty packaging and brand architecture. He did the original Hargrove Reserve label. Bud mentioned it. Didn't want to say more than that. She thanked him. She waited until the door closed, then she put her hand flat on the photograph. By midday, she was in the East Cellar, where they kept the oldest estate vintages and the original production records in a cedar cabinet along the back wall. Reed was there ahead of her, pulling humidity readings from the monitors. She did not wait for him to finish. You designed the reserve label. He set the meter down on the cabinet top. He did not make her repeat it. I designed the reserve label. The cellar light came in through the single high window in a narrow bar. Dust moved in it. Outside, somewhere a bird called twice and went quiet. My father chose you when you were 29. He did. He told me he couldn't name you publicly. Said the attention would flatten the work. He told me the same thing about staying quiet too long. She sat down on the edge of the cabinet stool the way a person does when their legs have made a decision before their head has. She held very still. The way someone does when something unexpected has come up fast, and they haven't decided yet whether to brace for it or let it move through them. You are going to lead the label and identity division. I was going to. What happened? He did not say her name. He said my wife got sick. We came back to Napa from Portland to be closer to her family. She lived 14 months. After she was gone, I went to my studio and looked at the drafting table and knew I would hate the next line I drew. So I didn't draw it. Sloan was quiet for a long time. Why did you come here specifically? Because the reserve label is in the production archive in that cabinet. Because the Valley is where Ren started school. Because Bud needed a second pair of hands, and I needed something physical to do, and there was nowhere else I was willing to be. She nodded. She stood. She did not reach toward him. She walked to the cellar door and stopped with her hand on the frame. He should have let you put your name on that label. He understood why I asked him not to. I know he did, she said. He always did. She left. Reed stood in the narrow bar of light from the high window and did not move for a long time. 2 floors up in his private office at the Drummond Group, Warren Drummond opened the locked drawer of his credenza and removed a sealed envelope marked Hargrove Family Trust, Secondary Provision 2016. He looked at it for a moment. He put it back. He picked up his phone. Push the review hearing up, he said. 30 days is too generous. Reed came home that evening and Ren was at the kitchen table again. She had drawn a new version of the same animal. This time it had correct proportions. 4 legs, appropriate ears, something like a mane. That's a horse, he said. I know, she said. I went to the school library. He kissed the top of her head and sat down across from her. She colored in the legs without looking up. Dad. Yes. Tomorrow. Are you going to work before I wake up? Probably. She filled in the hooves with brown pencil. Is she pretty? He set his water glass down very carefully. Ren, you don't have to tell me, she said. She didn't look up. She started on the mane. Owen watched her for a long time and did not know what to do with a part of himself that had just been seen by his 8-year-old. 3 days later, Sloan sent Reed a message through the estate's internal work system. It was 4 sentences. A regional hospitality group wanted a custom label for a private label contract. She wanted to talk through the creative parameters. Could he come up to the estate office at 3 o'clock? He came up at 3. Her office was in the east wing, full of afternoon light off the upper slope. She closed the door and did not sit at the desk. She sat in one of the 2 chairs by the window and gestured to the other. I'm not the right person for a contract label project, he said. I know. Then why am I here? She didn't answer immediately. She set a folder on the small table between them and did not open it. This is not a conversation about a label contract, Reed. This is me asking whether you want to come back. He sat back. I'm not coming back. Why? He looked out the window. A hawk was working the air over the south block, writing something invisible. He had not said any of what he was about to say out loud to anyone except Bud, and Bud hadn't asked. At the end, Mira was in a room I had painted the color of the hill in late September, because she said she wanted to feel like she was already outside. I didn't draw a single line for those 14 months. After she died, I went to my studio and looked at the drafting table, and I knew if I drew the next line, I would hate it. So I haven't drawn one in 3 years. If I draw one now, I'll find out whether I still hate it. And I'm not ready to find that out. Sloane sat very still. Thank you for telling me, she said. She did not try to walk him back from it. She did not lean forward. She put her hands flat on her knees and looked at him with a steadiness that did not ask anything of him in return. There was a knock at the door. Cass opened it before she could answer. Sorry, he said. Mr. Calloway, the school tried to reach you. Your phone went to voicemail. Reed stood. Behind Cass in the outer office, Wren was standing very small next to a young woman in a school staff lanyard. Wren had her backpack on and was holding a library book in both hands, her finger marking a page she had not finished. Sloane walked out before Reed did. She crossed the outer office and crouched down so she was level with Wren and held out her hand. I'm Sloane, she said. Your dad has been keeping this place running since before the harvest. Wren took her hand. I'm Wren. I know. The school called ahead. The staff member said something about a missed pickup window and an after-school program that had ended early. Reed heard it without fully processing it. He stood in the doorway and watched his daughter take a stranger's hand without looking at him first, for permission. The storm system came in from the northwest on a Thursday, earlier than the forecast had indicated. By 4 in the afternoon, the National Weather Service had issued a wind advisory for the valley. By 6, the gusts were projected to 40 miles an hour overnight. The harvest was 90% complete, but the last of the old vine zinfandel on the upper slope had not been brought in. 62 rows, irreplaceable fruit, 30-year-old rootstock. Bud put out a crew call. Reed stayed. He sent Wren to the neighbor 2 properties over. He worked through the early evening with the harvest hands they could reach, securing the sorting equipment, moving the picking bins under cover, laying frost protection over the uncollected rows with whatever hands were available. By 7:30, the rain started. By 8, the wind was in the vines. At 8:15, a pair of headlights came up the service road and stopped beside the equipment barn. Sloane got out wearing field clothes, work boots, a headlamp already on. She did not say anything. She walked directly to the east end of the uncovered rows and started tucking frost cloth along the anchor wire. Bud looked at Reed across the bed of the utility truck. Reed didn't say anything. He went back to work. For 2.5 hours, she worked beside the crew. She knew the anchor wire system. She knew which rows ran east-west and needed double coverage on the windward side. She had done this beside her father from the time she was 11. And her hands knew the motions before her mind caught up with them. She did not speak to Reed except to call out row numbers and ask for confirmation. He did not speak to her except to confirm. Once, across the width of a row in the rain that had turned horizontal, they looked at each other through the dark. Neither of them looked away for the count of 3. Then she called the next row number, and they moved on. By 10:30, the wind dropped. The system had tracked north of the forecast cone after all. The upper slope was intact. The old vine rows were covered. The crew gathered in the equipment barn with coffee from the thermos Bud always kept filled in emergencies. Sloane sat on the tailgate of the utility truck beside Reed. Her hair was wet against the back of her neck. Her breathing was still coming down from the work. Neither of them said anything about the night of the harvest dinner. Neither of them needed to. When she fell asleep sitting upright against the barn wall, Bud draped his jacket over her shoulders. Reed watched him do it. Bud met his eyes once and went back to drying his hands on a shop rag. By morning, the valley was calm. The old vine fruit was intact. That afternoon, a regional wine trade publication ran a short item online. 5 paragraphs, measured language. It noted that the CEO of Hargrove Estate had been observed in close proximity to a staff member on several occasions during a period of active trustee litigation, and that certain parties connected to the estate were raising questions about the appropriateness of the relationship given the ongoing review. It did not name Reed. It quoted no one on record. Sloane read it on her phone in the car outside the estate office. She called Reed from her desk at 2 o'clock. "Did you see it?" I sighed. "If you want to step back from everything, I won't hold it against you. I won't even ask you to explain." There was a long silence on the line. "No," he said. "Reed." I said no, Sloane. She closed her eyes. She held the phone against her ear and did not say anything for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She hung up. Across town, Warren Drummond read the item on his monitor and allowed himself, for the first time in 18 months, something close to satisfaction. 5 days later, Reed submitted a counter-proposal to the hospitality group's contract inquiry. He proposed instead a full restoration of the original Hargrove Reserve label and brand system. The work he had done at 29. The work that had been sitting in the production archive in the East Cellar for 8 years. He proposed a relaunch. Sloane approved it without a meeting. Bud took him down to the cellar and opened the cedar cabinet and pulled out the original flat files. The color separations had held. The label line was still clean. The work was still good. Reed stood beside the flat files for a long time with his hand on the edge of the folder. Wren came down on the Saturday school holiday. She climbed onto the estate house porch steps before Reed could suggest she wait. She sat on the top step with her knees pulled up, looking out at the vines. "Dad." "Yes." "Did you really make the label? The one on the bottles in the cellar?" "I made that label." "Who was it for?" "For Sloane's family." Wren looked out at the vines. She did not ask another question. Sloane arrived in the early afternoon. She wore jeans, a flannel shirt, no indication of the office. She sat down on the porch step beside Wren without asking and looked out at the same vines. Below the step, Reed worked on a section of fence post and could hear them. "You don't have a mom, do you?" Wren said after a while. Sloane was quiet. "How do you know that?" "Because you don't ask me about mine. People who have moms always ask." Sloane looked out at the upper slope. "My mom died when I was close to your age." Wren's voice small. "Do you still miss her?" "Every day. But I don't feel the sadness the same way anymore. I just remember her now." Wren nodded slowly. The nod of a child who has just been told something that she half already knew was true. "Me too," she said. Below the step, Reed sat back on his heels. He rested his forearm across his knee. He kept his hands still. He did not make a sound. At the end of the afternoon, Sloane walked Wren back to Reed's truck and waited beside her while Reed came around from the fence line. She didn't say goodbye. She touched Wren's shoulder briefly and walked back toward the estate house. That evening, Warren Drummond was waiting in the parking area of the estate office building when Sloane came down after her last call. He was standing beside her car with his hands in his coat pockets. "Vote with the trust review, Sloane." "No." "Then there's something about your father's arrangement with the original label artist I'll make part of the public record." She unlocked her car. "Warren, you don't have anything about my father that I haven't already dealt with." He smiled the way a man smiles who has been holding something for a long time and has decided tonight is when he plays it. "That's because he kept one part of it from you. I won't." He walked away across the parking area. His footsteps on the gravel went quiet when he reached the road. Sloane stood beside her car with her hand on the door handle. She did not get in for a long time. Monday morning, Bud asked Sloane to come to the records room at the back of the equipment barn. He locked the door behind her. He opened the old safe in the corner and removed a manila envelope that had been sitting there for 3 years. "Your father gave me this 8 months before he died," Bud said. "He told me to give it to you when you were ready to look at what's in it without flinching. I've been waiting 3 years. I'm not waiting any longer." She opened the envelope at the workbench. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a copy of a trust instrument dated 2016, executed before 2 witnesses. It assigned 9% of her father's personal Hardrow shares to a private trust, with voting rights held by a single named beneficiary until 2032. The beneficiary was Reed Calloway. The second document was a letter in her father's handwriting. She read it standing. He had written that he knew the estate would face a sale push after he was gone. He had written that he chose Reed because Reed had once turned down a licensing offer for the reserve label, rather than allow a production compromise on the paper stock. He had written that he needed Sloane to have someone beside her who understood that some things don't have a price, and that he could not think of anyone else. He had written that he hadn't told her in life because he didn't want her to inherit a decision. He wanted her to find her way to it on her own terms. He had written at the end, "If you're reading this, Bud believed you were ready. He has never been wrong about anyone I cared about." She folded the letter. She put both documents back in the envelope and looked at Bud. Drummond knew about this. He was the co-executor of the estate filing. He was supposed to notify Reed. He never did, Bud said. She nodded once. She left with the envelope under her arm. She drove off the property and through the valley and up into the hills to the cemetery where her father was buried under 2 old oaks at the eastern edge of the grounds. She parked. She walked up to the stone and sat down in the grass beside it. She didn't say much. "You should have told me," she said. The wind moved in the oaks. A crow landed on the fence 20 feet away and regarded her without concern. She stayed for an hour. She didn't hear Reed until he was already sitting down on the other side of the stone. He didn't look surprised to find her there. She didn't look surprised to find him. "You come here," she said. "Once a month since he died. I just got here today." He nodded. They sat on either side of the stone and looked out at the valley below. The light was moving west, and the color of the vines at this hour was something that had no good name. After a while, Reed said, "He didn't tell you because he knew you'd need to come to it yourself." He was right. "I knew 4 sides of him you don't," she said. "You knew one side I never got." Neither of them said anything for a while. When the light started to go, they stood at the same moment. They walked back along the gravel path to the parking area without speaking. They got into separate cars. She lifted a hand from the wheel as she pulled past him. He raised his. That night, Reed sat on the edge of Wren's bed for a long time after she'd fallen asleep. The window was open. The vineyard outside was quiet. He had not spoken to Mira in his head since early in the 2nd year, and that had felt like a natural ending. He found himself doing it now. He didn't ask permission. He said, "I think I'm going to start drawing again." Then he said, "I think it's going to be all right." He sat there for another half hour. Then he went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table until the sky outside the east window began to go gray. He was at the equipment barn by 5:30. Bud was already there. "I'll take the trust voting," Reed said. Bud looked at him over the rim of his mug. "For the people on this property. For what her father built here. Because she shouldn't have to stand alone in that room. Not for her alone, but not without her either." Bud set the mug down. He held out his hand. Reed took it. By Wednesday, Sloane had the trust voting paperwork executed. She and Reed sat at the kitchen table of the estate office with a list of 9 shareholders, of whom 5 might be persuadable. They had 4 days until the review hearing. They spent the next 4 days in meetings. Sloane brought the financial modeling. Reed brought the brand restoration plan he had not let himself articulate in 3 years, a heritage estate with a reopened creative division, producing a premium label line under the Hargrove name, 110 jobs preserved, 14 new ones phased in over 24 months. He spoke about the work the way he had spoken about it at 29, without hedging, without the long pause before each sentence that had become his habit. By Thursday evening, they had commitments from 4 of the 5. Thursday night, Wren was asleep on the office sofa under Sloane's barn jacket. Reed had brought her because school was out for a staff development day, and the neighbor was visiting family in Sacramento. Sloane had laid the jacket over her at some point without being asked and without saying anything about it. At 10 o'clock, Sloane stood up from the table to stretch. Reed stood too. They ended up on the same side of the table in the half-light from the desk lamp. Wren sleeping 10 feet away. He reached up and moved a strand of hair from her face. He stopped with his hand still close to her cheek. She didn't move. Neither of them did anything. He could have closed the distance. She could have turned her face toward him. Neither did. Sloane said, softly. Not yet. I know, he said. He stepped back. She stepped back. He went around to the other side of the table. She sat across from him. They did not speak for a minute. Then they went back to the holdout list. It was the closest either of them had come to choosing easy over right. They had chosen right. They both knew it without talking about it. Late that night, after Reed had carried Wren out and Sloane had locked up the office, she sat at the estate desk and opened her laptop. Her attorney had forwarded an email that morning, flagged from the estate archive. It was from Drummond to the co-executors outside counsel, dated 6 months after her father's death. It read, "Do not notify the secondary trust beneficiary until I give confirmation. Confirmation may not come." She read it 3 times. She forwarded it to her own attorney with one line, "File Friday morning before the hearing." She closed the laptop. Friday morning. The conference room of a regional law office in St. Helena. 9 shareholders seated around the table. The trust review panel along the side wall. Drummond presented the outside acquisition offer, first $41 million for controlling interest in the estate and full rights to the Hargrove label and brand archive. The numbers were structured to look generous. He included, near the end of his presentation, a reference to the Trey publication article, not by name but by implication, suggesting the current CEO's judgment was subject to personal interference during a material decision period. He held on that slide a beat longer than necessary. Sloane stood. She was not dramatic about it. She walked to the front of the room and placed 3 documents on the table in front of the panel. She read the trust instrument aloud. She read her father's letter aloud. Her voice did not change register. Then she put the 3rd document on the projector. Drummond's email to outside counsel, 6 years old, instructing them to suppress notification of the secondary trust beneficiary. The room went still. An older shareholder named Patterson Grayhair, 40 years in the valley, someone who had known her father since before Sloane was born, leaned forward. "Warren," he said, "tell me I'm misreading this." Drummond did not say anything. Patterson sat back. He looked at the table. He looked at Sloane. Reed stood from his seat at the far end of the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't open with anger. He laid out the restoration plan he and Sloane had built over the previous 4 days. The heritage estate preserved. The creative division reopened under the Hargrove name. 110 jobs intact. 14 new positions phased in over 24 months. Projected label revenue within 4 years. He spoke about the work the way a man speaks about something he has been keeping very quiet about for too long. He finished by saying, "Thomas Hargrove trusted me not to sell what he'd spent his life building. I'm not going to sell it. His daughter shouldn't have to stand in this room alone. That's all I have." He sat down. The vote was called by shares. Sloane's 33%, Reed's 9% trust, Patterson's 11%. 3 additional shareholders voted with them. The total against the acquisition offer came to 64%. The motion failed. Patterson made the second motion himself, that Warren Drummond be removed from his position as co-executor and trust advisor immediately, pending civil action for breach of fiduciary duty by the Hargrove estate. The vote was unanimous, excluding Drummond. Drummond stood. He gathered his papers. He did not look at anyone at the table. He walked to the door. He stopped in the hallway outside, where the afternoon light came through a window at the end of the corridor, and landed in a long rectangle on the floor. A journalist from the regional business paper was calling his cell. He let it ring. He had spent 22 years building leverage in this valley, and he could not, standing in that hallway, think of a single useful thing to say. In the conference room, Sloane and Reed did not look at each other immediately. Sloane thanked the shareholders for their time. Patterson came over and put his hand on her arm. "Your father would have been proud of how you handled that," he said. She nodded. "Thank you," she said. "He always liked hearing that from you." When the room had emptied, she and Reed were left at the long table. They sat for a moment in the quiet. Out the window, the valley was full of late afternoon light, and the vines on the hillside across the road were the particular color they got in October when the season was finally done. She said, "We should get out of this room." He stood. "Yes." They walked out together. That evening, they ate at Reed's house at the south end of the property. Sloane brought an apple cake she had made in her own kitchen that afternoon between calls with her attorney. The edges were slightly overdone. Wren ate 2 pieces and did not say anything about the edges. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and the dry sweetness that came off the vines at the end of harvest. Even now, even after the season was through, Wren talked about school. The 3rd grade class was doing a unit on California ecosystems. Her teacher had told them about the species of birds that lived in the valley year-round. Sloane named 3 of them correctly and knew which one nested in the old oak at the north fence line because her father had shown her when she was close to Wren's age. Wren looked at her with the careful wonder of a child who was revising something she thought she already understood. After the dishes, Wren went down the hall to brush her teeth without being asked. Reed stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her go. "What?" Sloane said. She used to need to be told. "How long since?" "Tonight's the first time." Sloane did not say anything to that. She picked up the dish towel and started drying. After Wren was in bed, they went out to the back porch. The vineyard beyond the fence was dark. The lights of the next property blinked through the tree line. They stood at the rail without speaking for a while. "The night of the harvest dinner," Sloane said. "I didn't plan to say what I said. I didn't know I was going to say it until it was already out." Reed kept looking at the vines. "I'd been saying it in my head for 5 months," he said. "Every time I saw you walk the rows in the morning, I never said it out loud once." "Why not?" "I didn't think I had the right." "You always had the right." He turned to look at her then. The porch light was low. Her face was half in shadow. "What now?" She didn't answer right away. She let the question sit for a moment. Then she reached for his hand. Not his fingertips, his whole hand. He took hers. Neither of them squeezed. They just held. They did not kiss. They stood on the back porch of his house at the south end of the property and held hands and watched the vineyard go fully dark and did not need anything more than that for that night. After a while, Sloane said, "I should go home." "All right. I'll be back tomorrow." "All right." She went down the porch steps. She did not look back at the door, but she raised her hand without turning. He stood at the screen and watched her get into her car and watched the taillights move down the service road until the tree line took them and the sound of the engine was gone. Inside, the kitchen light was still on. He turned it off. He stood in the dark with his hand on the switch. He could hear Wren breathing in the back bedroom. He could hear the wind in the vines. He had not known 3 years ago that there was a version of his life waiting on the other side of the one he had been living. He had not let himself look for one. Tonight, for the first time, he could see it clearly. He went to bed. 6 weeks later, on the last Saturday of November, with the valley in a warm spell and a light wind out of the north, and the sky the particular pale color it gets after the season is fully done, the Hargrove Reserve label went back to press. It was a small thing. No announcement. The estate crew there, Wren, Sloane, Bud. Reed had redrawn the label from memory, and the line had come back without the hesitation he had feared. It was the same as it had been at 29. It was better, because his hand had steadied in the years since. Wren sat at the edge of the press room and watched the first sheet come off the roller. "Dad." "Yes." "Is that really the one?" "That's really the one." She looked at it for a long time. She did not touch it. She looked at Sloane, who was standing beside Reed at the press with her hand on the edge of the feed tray. "Are you going to keep making things here?" Wren asked her. Sloane looked at Reed. He was looking at the label coming off the press, at the line he had drawn at 29 that had been waiting 8 years in a cedar cabinet for him to come back to it. "I was hoping to," Sloane said. Wren nodded once with the efficiency of a child who has just received the answer she was looking for and does not need it repeated. The press ran. The labels came off clean. Outside the press room window, the valley was still. and gold and the old vines on the upper slope stood in their rows, the same as they had stood for 30 years, patient and exact, waiting for someone to understand what they were worth. Reed had his hand on the work he had made at 29. A woman he had not allowed himself to want stood beside him. A daughter he had carried alone for 3 years sat at his feet. He had not, 3 years ago, thought a day like this was still possible for him. It was possible. The press held its line. I keep coming back to the moment Reed stood in that cellar with his hand on a folder he hadn't opened in 8 years. He didn't open it because he was ready. He opened it because Sloane asked him a question he couldn't answer with silence anymore. And I think about how long something true can sit in a cedar cabinet waiting for the right person to walk through the door and simply ask. There's a version of this story where Reed draws the next line the week after Mira dies, where he forces himself back to the drafting table because that's what people say you're supposed to do. Keep moving, stay busy, don't let grief take up too much room. And maybe he produces something fine. Maybe it's technically correct. But it wouldn't have been the work he brought back when he was finally ready, steady-handed and clear-eyed, drawing from a place that had healed rather than one that was still bleeding. The years he didn't draw weren't wasted. They were load-bearing. That's something I had to learn the hard way myself, that the pause is sometimes the work. What Reed did, quietly, across the whole of this story, was choose to do the right thing even when doing it cost him something. He turned down the licensing offer at 29 because the paper stock wasn't right. He refused to vote against Sloane even when the article made it easier to walk away. He stepped back from her in the half-light of the office at 10 o'clock at night, not because he didn't want to close the distance, but because he understood the difference between what he wanted in that moment and what was actually good. That's not instinct. That's character that got built slowly, decision by decision, in situations where no one was watching, and no one would have blamed him for choosing differently. I think that's what integrity actually looks like when you get close enough to see it. Not grand gestures, but small, correct choices made in the dark. And Sloane. The way she read her father's letter standing up at a workbench and did not cry. The way she drove to the cemetery and sat down in the grass and said what she needed to say to someone who couldn't answer her anymore. That took a different kind of strength. Not the kind that fights back, but the kind that holds still long enough to understand what it's actually looking at. She had every reason to let the trust review roll over her. She had the emotional weight of her father's death, the public insinuation about her judgment, a boardroom full of people who had already decided. What she brought instead was clarity. She had done the work of understanding the situation completely before she walked into that room, and that clarity was the thing that didn't break under pressure. Ren asking, "Is she pretty?" At the kitchen table is the detail I keep returning to. Children understand more than we think they do, and they ask the questions adults have already decided are too dangerous to speak out loud. She was 8 years old, and she saw her father more clearly in that moment than he could see himself. I think we underestimate how much the people closest to us already know, and I think Reed, sitting across from her with a water glass he set down very carefully, understood that he had just been seen, not judged. Seen. That's a different thing entirely, and maybe that's where it started. Not on the porch at the end, not in the office at 10 o'clock, but at a kitchen table with a brown pencil and a drawing of a horse, when a little girl decided her father was ready before he knew it himself.